Hey there. Before I get started, I want to let all of you know that I'm now on a new social media app called Clubhouse, and I'd love if you could join me there because I'm planning some really cool stuff. But Scott, you might be thinking, I'm already on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, LinkedIn, YouTube, Pinterest, TikTok, Reddit, Snapchat, Friendster, and MySpace. I don't need any more social media in my life. And I totally get that. But here's the thing about Clubhouse. It's an audio-only app, so it's different from all those other platforms. And in some ways, I think it's actually a lot cooler. They have these rooms where you could chat live, and actually hear the voices of other people who are fans of podcasts or like to swap travel stories or discuss pretty much any topic you could imagine. I've just created a far from home room for fans of this podcast, and I have a bunch of cool ideas of ways to use the app in the coming months to continue doing what I strive to do on this show, which is transporting listeners to far-flung parts of the world through immersive sound. I'm also hoping to organize listening events and behind-the-scenes Q&As with any of you who want to join me. Now, I should say that the app is fairly new, so it's unfortunately only available for iPhone users at this point. That means that if you happen to have some other sort of device, I'm afraid you're going to have to wait a bit longer. Also, you do need to be invited to join, so if you're not already in Clubhouse but would like to be, you should drop me a line at info@farfromhomepodcast.org because I have a limited number of invitations I can hand out to you. Finally, if you're already there and want to connect, just search for the Far From Home Club, or you can follow me at Scott Gurian, and I'll hook you up. Hope to see you there. I think this is going to be super fun. This is Far From Home. I'm Scott Gurian, and let me begin by saying that if you're not already doing so, you might want to listen to this particular episode with a good pair of headphones, because today we're talking about sound. As I'm sure all of you know, we're now 1 year into this global pandemic, and COVID has had all sorts of ripple effects that most of us never imagined. Air pollution plummeted as people stopped flying. Companies closed their office buildings for good as working from home has become the new normal. And here's another change you might not have thought much about. The pandemic has radically altered what the world sounds like. I read an interesting article in the New York Times last spring about a team of researchers from New York University who had installed 16 microphones all around the city prior to the pandemic to monitor noise pollution. So they had a pretty good sense of what New York typically sounds like. And the difference during the height of the coronavirus outbreak was remarkable. Here, for example, is a pre-pandemic recording made at the corner of Lafayette and East 4th Streets in the Greenwich Village neighborhood of Lower Manhattan. This is from an average day in mid-April of 2019. Okay, now here's another sound clip of that same intersection from almost exactly a year later, when the first wave of COVID was hitting the city and people were mostly staying home. It's pretty incredible. Some people remarked at the time that they were amazed they could stand in the middle of a normally busy street in New York City and actually hear birds for the first time in recent memory. Now, of course, COVID didn't just cause everything to become more quiet. During this time, New Yorkers also got used to the regular blaring of ambulance sirens at all hours of the day and night as the death toll continued to rise. And on a more positive note, there was also this phenomenon during the early days of the pandemic that actually took place in many cities around the world, where 7 o'clock would roll around each evening and people would stick their heads out their windows, step out onto their front steps, and have a little party, blaring music for a few minutes and applauding to show their support for all the healthcare workers and first responders. Now, I've been focusing on New York so far, but this change in the natural soundscape is something that took place on a global scale. With people now getting vaccinated, things are slowly starting to return to normal, but I thought it would be interesting on today's show to look at some examples from over the past year of how COVID-19 has affected the way the world sounds, for better or for worse. Joining me to help with this is Andreas von Bubnoff. He's a science journalist and multimedia producer based in Berlin, and he's one of the creators of the Pandemic Silence Project, which aims to capture the quieting down or change of the world's soundscapes during the COVID-19 pandemic. Andreas, thank you so much for joining me.
Sure, happy to be here.
So, how did the idea for this project come about?
Right, it goes back really to my childhood. Actually, I was exposed to nature sounds, which I didn't appreciate enough back then. Grew up next to a forest and got used to the wind in the trees, and we hiked a lot. I was exposed to nature sounds through that as well. And so I always had in the back of my mind, I suppose subconsciously, that I kind of enjoy that sort of soundscape. And then later on, what happened really was that I became interested in sound. I did a big soundscape project. And that made me aware of this part of soundscape ecology that looks at sounds disappearing or sort of like silences, and also like the opposite, which is of course noise, and how noise destroys nature in the sense that it disturbs animals so much that they become too stressed out. And that in turn alerted me to the September 11 attacks and the days after the attacks, and a study that came out that actually found that the stress level of whales was apparently lower than normal. And people thought it was because there was less noise from ships. So I thought, when I was a fellow at HITS in Heidelberg, that's an artificial intelligence institute. I was there for like 3 months to just think about anything I wanted to think about. That was actually in 2019, before the pandemic started. I was looking for silence recordings from the days after 9/11, and I just couldn't find much, or it just turned out to be much more difficult than I thought. So I kind of gave up on the thought as a project. But then the pandemic hit. I came back from Cambodia in March last year. And Cambodia was completely normal, and then I landed in Frankfurt, and everything was already in lockdown. And that's when it became clear to me we have to do a project.
And why is this field of research important to you? Why study the silence or changes in sound?
I think it's just that we are all so dominated by vision. Whenever we describe something, we use visual terms, right? We never really use auditory terms. But I think this auditory thing is so deep that we don't even notice how important it really is for us. In a way, it's kind of like trying to balance things and alerting people that, look, I mean, this is actually much more important than you think. There's not just light pollution, there's also noise pollution. And sounds can do really amazing things for our well-being.
Yeah. I worked in radio for many years, so I was trained to listen very closely to all the sounds around me. For example, if my editor would ever, send me out to interview someone, they usually wanted me to record in a relatively quiet space. But doing this sort of work, you quickly learn that there are a few places that are totally quiet. Like if you close your eyes, sit still and listen for a moment, there's all sorts of sounds all around you that you might not ordinarily notice. Maybe it's a gentle blowing of a breeze, or the ticking of a clock, or the hum of your lights or your refrigerator. And I think it's interesting now, as the world has kind of slowed down, that those sounds that were maybe ignored or thought of as just background noise in the past have suddenly become much more present for us. You actually created a website to gather and curate some of those sounds. So tell me how it works.
Right. So people send us sounds. People could upload them on the website. You ask people to send us also a picture. It doesn't have to be super fancy, just something, not too much visual. That's important, because then it becomes too distracting, right? And then just a comment, because we want to know how people feel about these sounds too, as they are filtered through their consciousness and how they experience them. That's also important. And all that we then show on the website on a map.
And you've agreed to join me today to share some of your favorite sounds people around the world have submitted to your project. So where should we start?
Let's see. In the beginning, the most expected thing you would probably hear is things that are empty, buildings that are empty. So let me play to you this one example. That was Airport Berlin, Tegel. It was completely empty. There was nobody. It was almost like a dystopic movie. And the only thing you could hear is sort of like the lights and the machines were still on. So the technosphere was still there. But people had disappeared, and the only thing you could hear was like a COVID announcement. So let me quickly play that.
Efforts to combat the spread of the virus are a challenge for everyone. Please keep 2 meters distance to other persons. Wash your hands thoroughly and regularly with soap and water for 20 to 30 seconds. Alternatively, use a hand disinfectant. Sneeze and cough exclusively into a tissue or the crook of your arm covered with textile.
It was interesting because, I mean, this was one of the examples where the absence of everything makes this announcement so much more pronounced, right? But let me give you something that was like in the early days that we also got. This is March 18, 2020 from Lombardy, Italy, where basically that was the worst area that was affected in the beginning, right? And we got a recording of this car, also like through the loudspeaker of the car, just basically telling people to not go outside anymore.
Buongiorno, questo messaggio è per tutti, mamme, papà, ragazzi, giovani, adulti, anziani. Per le strade di Brugherio c'è ancora in giro troppa gente. Se andiamo avanti così, aumenteranno le persone ammalate anche a Brugherio. Sconfiggere al più presto il coronavirus dipende da noi.
So this is sort of like the announcement part. We have a lot of announcements, of course, COVID announcements from all kinds of different places and times. But another thing that fits in a separate category would probably be animals become much more active. And one of them is coyotes that all of a sudden appeared in a Boston suburb. They just normally never go there. So that was nature coming back, and another one reached us from India, and that's what was interesting because the woman told us in April 2020 that all of a sudden the tree in front of her house in New Delhi was full of birds. This is actually one of my favorite recordings because she sounds so happy finding that the birds are all of a sudden there.
Nowadays, this tree is full of birds, birds chirping, and the birds are of different variety. And I also don't know, the birds which we used to think have become extinct. I can see them on this tree.
It's amazing, like people kind of went away back into their houses, into their buildings, and the animals came out. They were there all along, but people didn't notice them, or they were kind of scared away by all the human made sounds and all the machines and cars and vehicles and so forth. Are people sharing stories with you in addition to the sounds they're sending in?
Yeah. I mean, they do talk about how they are, happy or unhappy about the sounds. For example, there is this one guy from England. He said that the pheasant call and the morning chorus was just the clearest he had ever heard. So a lot of people actually enjoy the sounds, but other people actually felt very disturbed by it, and they thought it was kind of like a dark silence. One negative way someone reflected on that was from the inside of an apartment in Germany. A student sent us a sound from her dorm where you can hear her washing the dishes, trying to stay isolated and protected from infection, whereas the people in the next room had guests, and she was basically scared of that. Normally these sounds wouldn't mean much if you would just listen to them, but if you hear that comment in addition, it becomes very valuable and interesting.
So I guess the context makes all the difference. How many recordings have you received so far, and from how many countries?
Hundreds from dozens of countries. The problem is that we almost got nothing from Africa and South America. But if any of your listeners has any suggestions as to like spread the word to those parts of the world, I would really appreciate it.
So if any of my listeners happen to be listening in some of those underrepresented parts of the world, in a few minutes I'll tell you how you could submit your own sounds. A lot of your recordings are of places that are much quieter than they would normally be, or maybe people are hearing things like birds that were there all along, but they were drowned out in the past amid all the other noises. But you also have some recordings people sent you of new sounds that are specific to the pandemic. Like I think you have a recording from Tunisia someone sent you, I believe.
Yeah, that was an interesting one because it had this sort of combination was interesting. You can basically hear the prayer from a mosque and a helicopter at the same time because this is curfew now and the helicopter tries to enforce that, so it's almost like a war situation. But the prayer still sounds like normal life. So there's a strange combination probably that you wouldn't normally hear in any other situation.
You're looking at all these submissions through the lens of kind of a researcher and science journalist. So as you listen back, are there any particular trends or patterns that you think have emerged?
I mean, one trend that we definitely observed and heard and realized is happening is that people have become so annoyed and so tense everywhere. And that tension sometimes erupts and, things like distancing and people scared of others approaching them too much. There's this one recording at the beach in the Canary Islands where one person is complaining, don't get too close to me, you're not wearing a mask and please stay away. And then they start arguing about that mask thing. And also, of course, at that beach there were announcements the whole time as well.
Esto es vida. Respetar los accesos a las playas y las normas sanitarias es vida. Mantener limpio tu entorno y hacer deporte de manera individual es vida. Y disfrutar de manera responsable de las playas de la ciudad es vida. Ayuntamiento de las Palmas de Gran Canaria, Ciudad de Málaga.
Vaya, hombre. No, enfado no, como no enfada, vamos a ver, porque yo no estoy enfadada, estoy hablando un poco brusco.
What do you think is the most interesting sound you've received? Or do you have a favorite?
I think that the most emotional ones are the most captivating, where humanity comes through. There was this street cleaner, the empty streets of Barcelona, and he just started to sing.
Ella sigue soltera, de repente quedó, hay que no tiene quien la quiera. Vamos allá, flamenco. De repente quedó, y si ella sigue soltera, hay que quedó.
I love that one.
I'm not sure if you care to speculate, but are you thinking of this project as just capturing a snapshot in time, or do you think there are ways that our soundscape might be kind of permanently altered as a result of this pandemic?
I'm afraid not. Let me give you an example. The lockdown is over in Berlin, sort of-ish, and today was basically almost as crazy as before. And I noticed that the honking of the cars, you couldn't hear anything for weeks, but today it was just insane. And I was in an Uber today. People are driving aggressively, just like before. There's no difference. I'm afraid it's not here to stay.
How does that make you feel? Do you kind of like the silence or the quietness?
I mean, look, we were walking around in Berlin to make recordings, right? And sometimes even to us, it wasn't really clear until it was gone just now how unusual the situation was. In the past few weeks, the streets were relatively empty. There were a few cars, and I thought, yeah, it's probably like that normally, isn't it? And we kept discussing that, and we were like, yeah, let's take a recording anyway. And then so now it becomes clear that it was totally unusual, right? That's probably why in the beginning there was still originality of situation. It was still new to everyone, and now we're getting a lot less submissions, probably because people are just thinking, oh, is this really special? Is it really different? And they don't realize that it actually still is.
You don't realize what you've had till you've lost it, or until it changes, I guess.
Exactly.
Yeah. So you're still looking for submissions for your project?
Yes, we're still looking for submissions, also like waiting for the world to come back. We want to hear how that sounds and then compare the two, of course, and hear people's feelings about that.
And so if people want to contribute, where should they go?
Just go to pandemicsilence.org, and there's going to be an upload button. It's going to be very prominent, and just click on that and upload the sound.
And they don't need any special recording gear. They could just record on their phone or whatever.
Yeah, just use the voice memo app, press the button, and then share it with our email. That's pandemicsilence@gmail.com. Or you could even WhatsApp it to us, and there's a WhatsApp number as well.
And people could help you crowdsource the sound of the world during a global pandemic. Thank you so much. I really appreciate you being with me.
Sure. Thanks for having me.
So you should all go check out the Pandemic Silence Project's website. Even if you don't have any interesting sounds you want to submit, it's really fun to browse their map of audio people recorded all around the world. Again, the address is pandemicsilence.org. And while you're browsing the World Wide Web, you might as well swing over to my website at farfromhomepodcast.org to dig into my archives and check out tons of bonus content from past episodes I've released. If you're a new listener to the show, I've done some pretty cool stories over the years, so I encourage you to go back and explore. Remember, you could also follow Far From Home on Instagram, Facebook, and now Clubhouse, and I'm on Twitter at Scott Gurian. And if you like this podcast, I'd love if you could help spread the word to your friends on social media so more people find out about it. And you could consider posting a review on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen. My credit music is a track called Bachata Luna by violinist David Shulman. You can check out more of his work at his website, quietlifemotel.com. Until next time, thanks for listening.
I should probably maybe end with this crazy sound from New Year's Eve from Culiacan in the state of Sinaloa in Mexico, where the cartels were. They actually shoot in the air. They shoot guns at New Year's Eve. So in the comments it actually says this is a very dangerous tradition as it wounds people every year. That's what the person says. Maybe we can end with that.